Been looking forward to this presentation for quite some time, and I'm delighted to see so many law students at this symposium today. I know your attendance is here because of your interest in the Constitution and freedom and liberty. It wasn't the free lunch that they provided. Today, I want to give you a different perspective and give you an idea of what is actually happening around the country regarding an Article V convention. My business is economics, and for the last 15 years, I've traveled this nation advising communities and states on how to improve their economies, to improve the standard of living for the people who live and work there. And over this period of time, it was becoming harder and harder for communities to improve the standard of living for their people. And through my analysis and understanding of what was happening, I could see that a great deal of the reasons for that were the policies coming out of the federal government. And I continued to examine this and became very distressed. The enormous debt that was being compiled by the federal government, and also the intrusion of the federal government into the business community and our economic freedom. And the more I researched it, the more distressed I became. And I began to wonder, as I looked at the debt and the amount of money they had borrowed, who was to blame for this happening? Whose fault was it that we sat back and watched this expansion of the federal government far beyond its constitutional authority and the irresponsible fiscal activity? Whose fault was it? Well, I discovered it was my fault. My fault because I did not recognize what was happening, and I did not take any action and speak out for it. And so back in 2008, I decided to take some action for it. I made a conscious decision that I was going to make the commitment to reverse what was happening. So I researched heavily into the Article V avenue of amending the Constitution, wrote arguments for 10 different amendments, wrote a book called The 10 Amendments for Freedom, distributed that nationally in January of this year, and launched an effort to cause an Article V convention to occur. That's why I'm here today. You know, back in 1787, our founding fathers met to form a new government. The Articles of Confederation were dysfunctional. They weren't working. They wanted to set up some type of central government to give some authority to this central government. And they also realized there was danger in what they were doing. Danger because in a 1,000-year history, they knew that there's always individuals who wanted to take power over others. And they were afraid that if they created this national government, that eventually they would have power over others. They knew that there were people who would try to use the Treasury to purchase our freedom. They knew these people were out there that would try to expand this power beyond what they were granted. And they were right. Because these founding fathers understood the nature of government. And the nature of government always wants to expand. It wants to grow. It's because people are involved in government, and unfortunately, some people always crave power and money, and they use the government to achieve that. Let's take a look at some of the things that have happened, especially over the last 40 years. Over the last 40 years, our Congress has borrowed money year after year after year to fund its programs, to assure their reelection, and they have amassed a crushing debt. They've usurped the powers of state government, city government, county government, and schools through the use of their treasury. They have hidden from view massive pieces of legislation by burying it within popular legislation, concealing it from the people, concealing from their own members, legislation that never would have become law had it been visible and apparent to the people. They have regulated, how do we get out of it? Hold on. Postpone.
Just press return. Just press return.
Just hit return. I had to get my glasses on so I could even see what I was doing there. They've regulated and taxed and have infiltrated the system we called economic freedom, attacking the private sector so much they've even taken title to private sector businesses. Let's take a look a little bit about some of these issues. I prepared here in our graph the budget deficit for the federal government from 1970 through 2008. And we can see that back here in 1970, and the red, by the way, is deficit spending. borrowing and borrowing and borrowing over these years until we reach roughly 1999 in the year 2000. We can see that that debt, that borrowing actually was reduced going into the late 1990s. Now, Congress did make some effort to reduce spending during this period of time. However, most of that budget surplus was absolutely credited to unanticipated income being thrown off from capital gains tax from the dot-com boom. Remember that was happening? Even though these lines are green, and what that means is the cash coming in was greater than the cash going out, we actually had an increase in our gross national debt after Congress had to account for the interest that they owed to the trust funds from which they had borrowed money. Over this period of time, Congress borrowed $9 trillion to fund its programs. Well, what has happened since, and what do they plan to do? Well, Congress set a record in deficit spending in 2008, 2009, and 2010. They will likely set another record. Over the next 10 years, they plan on borrowing $1 trillion a year. An additional $7 to $10 trillion will be borrowed by the year 2020. On average, each year, the workers' wages during this period of time, from 1970 to 2008, worker wages increased 5% per year. Revenue to Congress increased 7% per year. On average, Congress borrowed 23% more each year than what they took in. The trust funds, those of you who are here who are legal scholars, and even if you're a common citizen, a trust fund is in theory a bank account. Congress over the years has set special taxes where those special tax revenues are supposed to go into a special fund. And the only means for expenditure for that are limited to the qualifications of that fund. As an example, we have a gas tax. All money from the gas tax goes into the transportation fund. And the only legal use of that fund is for roads, highways, and bridges around the United States. There's more than 500 trust funds on the federal level. Guess what? Congress, there's supposed to be $300 billion accumulated in the Medicare bank. It has all been spent. There's supposed to be $295 million in the Military Retirement Trust Fund to pay the retirement benefits of a retired military personnel. It has all been spent. There's supposed to be $750 billion in the Civil Service Retirement Trust Fund. It has all been spent. There's supposed to be $2.5 trillion in the Social Security Trust Fund. It has all been spent. All of this money must be repaid when these individuals retire. That burden will fall upon little kids in kindergarten today. For the rest of their life, they will have to repay the money borrowed, along with their children and their children. Borrowing money is not the only problem. Congress has been able to manipulate its own legislative process. They have hidden from view, as I mentioned before, important legislation, regulations, fees, and taxes that never would have been passed by Congress, simply by burying it in popular legislation. Let me give you a couple examples. In 2006, they passed the Pension Protection Act. Now, what that is, that was a law that set rules and regulations for private pension programs offered by private corporations. Guess what? It was 393 pages, which seems to be about the average length now for a bill in Congress. On page 331, there are 62 pages of new law establishing new duties and tariffs for products being imported into the United States. Now, how that's associated with the private pension, I don't know, but one who wants to know duties and tariffs certainly wouldn't go to a bill titled for private pensions. We also discover that within that, the city of Portland, Oregon, got to import 3 tramway cars from the Czech Republic duty-free. They also got to have all their spare parts imported duty-free in the future. The Emergency Wartime and Supplemental Appropriations Act was passed in 2003. Now, this was not, the Iraqi-Afghan war was not really controversial at that time. All this stuff had already started. So this bill really was not a controversial bill. But on page 31, we find a unique thing. It took an act of Congress to determine that wild seafood may now be labeled as organic seafood. Also on page 32 of this bill, we have $3.3 million being appropriated to settle a music licensing dispute with the European communities. Now, apparently this averted us from going to war with Europe. The Energy Independence Act and Security Act had 310 pages. On page 302, we discover that there's a new government mandate having all government-owned swimming pools must install a new pool drain in them. Now, they have to do this within a year of passage. I suspect that most cities and counties and universities that have a swimming pool wouldn't have done it within a year of passage, because this was buried so deeply in the energy bill that even a coal miner couldn't have found this regulation. The former Vice President Protection Act was passed in 2008. Now, this was not a big deal. Apparently they hadn't had a sufficient Secret Service protection for the vice presidents in the past. This was only a 6-page bill, 6 pages. Only the first 23 lines dealt with protecting the vice president. The balance of it was new law dealing with identity theft. Apparently, that part of the identity theft couldn't have been passed unless it was, passed along the coattails of Dick Cheney at the time. Now, most of these examples I've given to you have been kind of humorous, but it does give an example of the frequency of which they've been doing. A lot of this stuff isn't that funny. We remember back in the fall of 2008, the Treasury Department told our Congress that if they did not pass within 24 to 48 hours a massive multi-billion-dollar appropriation to fund our financial system, that the U.S. system would go into receivership and could bring down the entire international banking community and throw the United States and the rest of the world into a depression. They had to pass this bill within 48 hours. You have to do it. You have to appropriate hundreds of billions of dollars. So Congress reacted. They also remembered their new talent of including things in bills. The 169-page bill, also known as TARP, only the first 42 pages dealt with TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. What else was in there? Well, there was more. On page 42 starts the Energy Improvement and Extension Act, 54 pages of new law that regulated the energy community, including new carbon taxes and regulations. Nothing to do with troubled assets. There's more. On page 97, we start the Tax Extenders and Alternative Minimum Tax Relief Act. 20 pages of new tax law was included. There's more. Next comes the Paul Wellstone and Pete Domenici Mental Health and Parity Addiction Act. This mandated upon private insurance carriers that offered corporate health care plans for many corporations the mandatory provision of mental health coverage. This was included in TARP. Wait, there's more.